1865. The United States had just concluded a devastating civil war. By the dawn of the 20th century, America will have become a world power. But first, the groundwork had to be laid. Industrialization exploded, ushering in a period of confidence and optimism that would define the American character. U.S. territory spilled out into the Caribbean and Pacific in a burst of expansionism, forcing the U.S. to grapple with its new role as an imperial power. A course that would define America in the 20th century. European nations had long established imperial colonies. The British in India, the French in Indochina, the Spanish in the Pacific and the Caribbean. In the 19th century, they turned their attention to Africa, carving it up. Eventually, only Liberia and Ethiopia were left as independent countries. Russia had even crossed the Bering Strait and established a foothold on the North American continent. It was in this competitive climate that the United States found itself. There were citizens who believed that if the U.S. did not join the land rush, it would lose out. What was the interest in expansion? There were three reasons. The most important was economic. During the Civil War, the U.S. had greatly increased its production of manufactured products, dictating a desire to find new markets abroad and a need for more raw materials. The second reason was military strength. Some believed that if the U.S. lacked powerful armed forces, it would not be able to defend its economic interests. The third reason was the belief in the racial superiority of Anglo-Saxons, white people of English descent, especially the British and their American cousins. In the late 1800s, many British and Americans believed it was the white race's God-given duty to civilize and Christianize the so-called inferior peoples of the world. British writer Rudyard Kipling's poem, The White Man's Burden, appeared in McClure's magazine, romanticizing this idea.
Take up the white man's burden, send for the best ye breed. Go, bind your sons to exile, to serve your captives' need. To wait in heavy harness on fluttered folk and wild, your new-caught, sullen peoples, half devil and half child.
The expansionist philosophy was far from universal. A group of educators, writers, and social activists who called themselves anti-imperialists opposed expansion. They believed that imperialism was a threat to the American value system, that a democracy should not keep other countries in servitude. Activist Jane Addams castigated Kipling.
To protect the weak has always been the excuse of the ruler and tax gatherer, the chief, the king, the baron, and now at last of the white man.
The anti-imperialists also highlighted practical issues, the huge cost of maintaining army and navy, and the fear that expansion would take jobs away from U.S. workers. The late 19th century saw three particularly key expansionist events that set an imperialist mood for the 20th century. Among the staunchest advocates of expansionism was Matthew Culbreth Perry, a career Navy man. Perry recommended that the United States take active measures to secure a number of ports in the Pacific where they could refuel their coal-burning steamships. The island nation of Japan seemed ideal. There was one major problem. Japan had been closed to foreigners for over 200 years. In the summer of 1853, loaded with cannon, Commodore Matthew Perry's flotilla sailed into Edo Harbor, the gateway to Japan's imperial city. In a rosewood box wrapped in silk, Perry delivered a letter from President Fillmore asking the Japanese to open trade, to give fair treatment to shipwrecked sailors, and allow the U.S. the opportunity to refuel in Japanese ports. Along with the president's letter, Perry sent a cautionary one of his own.
Many of the large ships of war destined to visit Japan have not yet arrived in these seas, though they are hourly expected.
Perry's expedition wintered on the China coast, then returned in February with 8 heavily armed battleships. The threat of force proved to be enough to persuade the Japanese. On March 31, 1854, a treaty was signed that granted Fillmore's requests, opening the ports of Japan for trade with the U.S. Matthew Perry's gunboat diplomacy sounded a wake-up call for Japan, spurring them to strengthen their navy and modernize their nation. Another method of attaining territory was to buy it. In debt from the disastrous Crimean War, Imperial Russia was open to selling their territory across the Bering Strait, Russian Alaska. Its vast untamed wilderness was ridiculed as a dreary waste of glaciers, ice, white bears, and walruses. But U.S. Secretary of State William H. Seward had his eye on this piece of property since 1860. Seward saw Alaska's strategic value for trade or in the event of war. He also pictured potential in Alaska's resources, especially timber and furs. Seward was so eager to secure Alaska, he entered into negotiations with the Russian envoy, the Baron Eduard de Steckel, without the go-ahead of the President or Congress. On March 30th, 1867, Seward and de Steckel signed the Treaty of Cessation. The U.S. agreed to purchase Alaska from the Russians for $7.2 million, only 2.5 cents an acre, though Congress had yet to approve a single cent for the deal. Few Americans viewed Alaska as a bargain. The press mocked the purchase as Seward's folly and Seward's icebox. But nearly 1 year later, and after much political wrangling, the U.S. Treasury finally wrote the check, and Alaska became a U.S. territory.